Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education, and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. Today's program is a conversation with Kristina Eberbach, former Deputy Director of the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University, Human Rights Education Consultant, and Adjunct Assistant Professor at Columbia University. In this episode, Kristina discusses the origins of her interest in human rights and human rights education, how her undergraduate and graduate studies have influenced her work in human rights, her work at Columbia University's Institute for the Study of Human Rights, how her experiences overseas as a human rights advocate and educator continue to influence her work, and her role as an educational consultant to the University of Connecticut's innovative Human Rights Close to Home project. Well, today we have one of my most favorite people in human rights education, Kristina Eberbach, who is going to talk to us about her very interesting career in this field. How are you today, Kristina?
Good. Thanks for having me, Bill. It's an honor.
Sure. Tell us about how you first became interested in human rights issues and subsequently in human rights education.
Sure. Thanks. I was always interested in justice issues as a kid, but I actually wasn't exposed to the concept of human rights until college. And it was initially through the lens of human rights and conflict. 9/11 happened my freshman year, my first year of undergraduate, and seeing what happened in the context of the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq was really significant for me, but also seeing what was happening in the United States and elsewhere in the name of national security and anti-terrorism in terms of surveillance policies, detention of Guantanamo Bay, torture. So that had a really significant impact. And also then just being introduced to this word, human rights. As soon as I was introduced to this concept, I felt like I had something to hold on to. It was something that explained this thing that I cared so much about, but just didn't necessarily have the words for it. But in terms of human rights education, that was a little bit later on. I'll share one moment. We come to these things, I think, through a process, but one moment that was really influential for me was when I was working in Gulu in northern Uganda in 2007. And at the time, I was working with a local organization. And I should say this was for approximately 6 or 7 weeks. So it was a very short term for a specific reason of doing some vulnerability assessments for them. But I was working for a local organization that had started as what they called a night commuter center. So youth were coming into this town to escape attacks from the Lord's Resistance Army, which is a rebel group that was forcibly conscripting youth, often forcing them to commit terrible atrocities against their own families so that they felt that they could then never return. And the government at the time it was politically strategic to claim that the war and the conflict was over. And so the government was cutting off assistance to these night commuter centers. And although there hadn't been an attack in the IDP camps, the internally displaced camps, for approximately 6 months, youth and their families were continuing to show up to these centers. And it was for a lot of reasons, to have physical security, not even from a conflict perspective, but to escape domestic violence. Folks came because they were offered a free breakfast. by the World Food Program. And a lot of the youth, it was because then it was a chance to go to school because it was much closer. And so by staying at the night commuter center, it was a chance to go to school. And while all this was going on, there were some interesting debates going on with respect to transitional justice. The International Criminal Court had issued an indictment for Joseph Kony, who is the leader of this group. And he was claiming that if the ICC dropped those indictments, that he would come to the negotiating table. And what I saw were efforts by the International Criminal Court to do education around the court's efforts and what transitional justice means, but also ultimately to curry community, get support from the local community for these efforts. And the LRA and others were trying to do the exact opposite. And what I felt was missing was centering those folks in the decision-making processes. Because many of them, yes, they had opinions, of course, about what should happen, but they were also concerned, again, about their kids going to school, about land conflicts as they returned, getting food. Many were dying because of HIV and AIDS. So they had a whole host of concerns that seemed to go completely unaddressed by some of these processes that were rooted in human rights. But again, even specifically with respect to transitional justice, I just felt like their voices weren't being centered, and they weren't driving the process. And so that for me was really important in seeing play out what I had studied in terms of the importance of centering those most affected. And I felt like the best way that I could maybe try to do that is how do I support local communities in decision making? And I was then, interestingly, I went through a whole 2-year program on human rights, and we talked about things like capacity building, but the term human rights education never came up. And I was really fortunate enough to be invited to a lunch with Paul Martin and Monisha Bajaj, who were two people who were doing a lot of work around human rights education. And I had that similar moment of aha when they talked about how they understood human rights education. And for me, there are many tools to work on human rights. There's no one single right way. But for me, if we were going to our aim is to center people empowered to take effective change, human rights education is just such a key part of that. So from then on, human rights education was the thing that I decided I wanted to focus on.
Now, you had other experiences overseas, though. Can you talk a little bit about how those related to your worldview?
Sure, yes. So with respect to, right after undergraduate, my undergraduate degree, I was able to go to the ICTR in the Netherlands, which I kind of got in on a technicality because my undergraduate degree was in international law, institutions, and ethics. But it was a crash course in international criminal law. And it was a wonderful process, and I believe in the work of international criminal law, but I really wanted to focus more on, as we discussed, kind of the grassroots and trying to prevent these things in the first place rather than responding to them afterward. So that was a significant moment. But since then, I've had the opportunity to engage in a couple of different ways. So maybe I'll talk about one of my earlier experiences with human rights education and designing and implementing on my own. I'd done some work with others in terms of co-designing and co-facilitating, but I was invited to do some work with working with women in Iraq around human rights education with the State Department of the United States at a time when the United States was trying to kind of minimize its engagement. And it was just even in working with the State Department, it was an interesting exercise in a country that had been occupied and invaded by the United States. And through this process, I had a couple of eye-opening moments. One was, and again, it's seeing all the things you learn about human rights education play out in practice. And one of those was just how essential, again, local voices and participation really is. I had the opportunity to work with a couple of local individuals who didn't necessarily have a tremendous amount of background knowledge in human rights, but they knew their communities. And being able to work with them made all the difference. They were working and hired as interpreters, but what they did was so much more than language. I was able to work with them to translate it into local meaning. That was just absolutely essential. And give real life examples. For example, we were talking about different gender roles and rights. And one woman had said, she was an educator actually, and she said, this young uh, boy, he never wanted to come to school. He always wanted to stay with his mom and help her cook, and he never wanted to come to school. And so we were able to get him to come to school. And she was talking about this as a tremendous achievement, which I did my best to acknowledge and recognize. And then I asked the follow-up question of what is problematic about, a young boy wanting to help his mom in the kitchen. And she looked at me with this look of, lady, if you don't understand what I'm talking about, then why are you here? And I, in some ways, think I lost her a little bit. And unfortunately, at this particular session, my colleague couldn't join for security reasons. She couldn't be there. And I was recounting this, and she said, "Oh, Kristina, there's this local leader who's really well known, and he's always seen with flour in his arm hair because he's always helping his wife cook." And that would have been a great example of a man in our community who's challenging gender norms. And so, again, it just really drove home the importance, especially if you're doing work I won't even say overseas, in any community that's not your own community, of that's not to say people from the outside can't bring something to those conversations, but again, the local voices and perspectives are so important and they should be taking the lead, um, even if maybe there's something to be added from others. And also one of those I think is maybe introducing what might be considered taboo topics, things that maybe within that community they don't feel like they can introduce, that I was able to. But so just that was really significant in, again, just the really importance of having it be locally driven. I also saw how human rights could be manipulated for political reasons. I was asked by the State Department to sign off on a press release that said, through this workshop, these series of workshops, we're bringing democracy and human rights to Iraqis. And I had to have a really serious conversation with folks who were signing my paychecks about the fact that I wasn't going to issue that press release. Um, and I saw that, yes, they cared about human rights in the workshop, but what they really wanted to do was say they were doing it. And so just being wary of how human rights education can sometimes be used for purposes that are not necessarily related to human rights and human rights learning, that I, again, try to keep in mind anytime I'm doing work. So that was really significant. I can also, depending on how much time, we can talk about my work in Myanmar with law faculty. So that was a program that I did. The Institute for the Study of Human Rights got a grant to engage in human rights education in Myanmar, and specifically working with law faculty there. And in Myanmar, the system is that students study law as a 4-year undergraduate LLB program. And it was a really interesting moment to be in Myanmar because the political situation at the time was opening up a little bit. They were allowing more folks in. Some political prisoners had been released. There was a little opening in terms of free speech. And there were some efforts to reform education and address some needs for maybe some critical thinking and pedagogy. Of course, there's always that gap between policy and then what's happening in classrooms and in schools. But it was a really great opportunity. So we worked with law faculty to help them in turn be able to teach human rights to their students, both as a human rights class, but also integrate human rights into other elements of their teaching. And in so doing, also work on critical approaches to human rights education and critical pedagogies and critical understandings. And one of the things that I think was really special about this program was that we got to work with the same group of people over the course of almost 5 years. And to be able to see both the challenges that they were facing and yet what they were able to achieve was really tremendous. And I don't think anybody in human rights education expects things necessarily to change overnight. We're willing to play the long game, but it was really wonderful to see what they could achieve in such a short period of time in the face of a lot of institutional constraints, and fear still of speaking and discussing human rights. So if I can wave a magic wand, I would have so much of human rights education more long-term rather than these one-off workshops. And again, I participated in those workshops. I think they still have value, but there is such a difference when you get to work over a longer period of time with folks.
So you became part of the institutional framework at Columbia University with human rights. Can you tell us about what you felt you achieved there? Because there are many times we look back and say, all right, well, this was a one-time achievement, this was another one, but you were there for a long period of time. So can you give us that type of perspective?
Sure. How much time do you have now? Because I was there for 13 years and I had a couple of different roles. When I was hired for this position, it was a new position created because the director of education position, because the human rights master's program was being moved out of a cluster of different liberal arts and interdisciplinary studies programs and was going to be run by the Institute for the Study of Human Rights, but a major in human rights was in the process of being launched, which was one of the early freestanding majors that was not requiring a second major, for example. And it was wonderful to be able to build things with others from very little. And it was a really rewarding experience. There were a lot of institutional challenges, but maybe in terms of what is human rights, I'll talk about that a little bit, because in establishing a degree program or approving classes, you're saying something about what you think human rights is or what is important about human rights. And it was intellectually fascinating, but also it was a difficult position to be in to make those kinds of choices. And I certainly wasn't making those alone. But one moment was with the human rights major that I'll share. So the structure of it had been more or less established, but when I was going through and trying to see what course offerings might meet which requirements, because again, at the time we didn't have a significant line item to hire our own teachers. So we were relying on what was offered by other departments. And I realized there was a whole host of classes that really wasn't fitting into the predetermined requirement categories that had been set. Mostly those that I felt were being left out were related to, for example, economics and rights or labor rights, or gender and rights, or race and ethnicity, and a lot of things having to do with identity, indigenous rights. And so I'm glad that we were able to add another category of human rights to capture those really important dimensions of human rights. But there's an interesting tension, I think, in human rights education in this sense that it needs some structure, especially because a lot of new students who are contemplating the major were asking, what does it mean to have a degree in human rights? What am I going to tell my parents don't understand this thing that I'm studying? Like, what do I tell them? And so it does need some structure. And I remember somebody, I wish I could attribute this to them, but they said, or I read, if human rights is everything, then it can quickly become nothing. And so it does need to have some contours, and making choices about what those were was challenging because, again, if a course, both in terms of the degree requirements, but also looking at individual courses, is any course that looks at something bad that's happened in human history a human rights course or not? And again, here I think it's about process. Who's at the table, who's making these choices, how are they conceptualizing human rights? And I think that needs to be an ongoing process and an ongoing conversation. And moreover, I think there is maybe a tendency to focus on content. And I'd say this both about degree structures and also about classes, not only because there are some very real structural and institutional setups that tend to emphasize that, but I think human rights education and degree programs also need to think about not just what do students need to know, but this critical approach. What questions do they need to ask, and what skills or maybe dispositions or values. I think in K through 12, there's a lot of discussion about socialization and that component that I think often goes unaddressed or is assumed to be implicit within higher education, or that students are self-selecting and they already care about human rights, that they're going to be in a major, so maybe it doesn't need to be addressed. And then finally, I think something higher education can learn from human rights education, and something I certainly learned in this work, being connected to Human Rights Educators USA and other human rights educators, I learned a lot about different angles and approaches to looking at things. And something that I think is another component that K through 12 maybe does a little more intentionally is the component of the through. So if we talk about education about human rights, through human rights, and for human rights, the through component in terms of respect for human rights within learning environments, and the pedagogical components of that as well need to be examined. And also in university spaces, how are programs run? Are they representative? Are they inclusive? How much do the programs cost? And I know some colleagues, including Felisa Tibbetts and Andre Keat, have recently done some work. They have a book on human rights in university spaces, but that's something else that I think is really important that we looked at. And other programs need to do more, and we could have done more. But something that I certainly learned from the human rights education specific lens. And with respect to accessibility, one thing that I am proud of, although of course there was so much more to be done, is that when we started, there wasn't a single funding support for students. So no research stipends, no internship stipends, no tuition relief. And so being able to fight for budget lines on those things, as small as some of them were, I think is something I'm really proud of, especially with internships. As human rights has become more professionalized, which is great, there is increasing expectation of experience in this work, and a lot of NGOs don't have the resources necessarily to pay interns, although I personally think all human rights organizations should provide some sort of compensation. Those kinds of things were really important to me, that students shouldn't have to have 3 jobs just to also then do an unpaid internship in human rights.
It would sort of be contradictory that we ask people to participate and do these things and not pay them. It sounds rather sad to me.
Yeah. And, it wasn't a requirement, the internship. But if one of our goals is to send students out well placed to take action for human rights in a professional context, then I think it's something that needs to be supported. And again, human rights work, there's so much wonderful human rights work that happens absolutely outside of the bounds of structured NGOs and paid work. But that's what a lot of our students were spending a lot of money to be able to do. And so supporting those other dimensions was really important to me.
So you've been hired by Human Rights Close to Home as a specialist in strategy and curriculum. Now that program is rather, I think, exemplary because of its relationship between the K-12 schools and the university. So what exactly are you doing there, and how do you assess the effectiveness of that project?
Yes, I feel so lucky to be involved in this program because it is this really interesting collaboration between higher ed, but the folks that we're working with are high school students and K through 12 educators. And with the K through 12 educators, we're helping them to integrate human rights um, into their praxis, and they're developing human rights curriculum as part of this program. And students are supported in designing and implementing civic action projects in their own communities, which is part of this close to home component. And so my job is manyfold. I should say I'm part-time also with this position. Um, and it evolves based on where the program is and what it needs. But a lot of the work has been in the beginning designing human rights education, our summer institute. Teachers and students learn together over the course of a week. And I think that's a really special component of this intergenerational and co-learning that happens amongst students and teachers. And again, speaking to this component of education through human rights, it was really great to see how, and we intentionally tried to facilitate uh, a sense that everybody's voice mattered, their experiences mattered, but we were particularly attentive to the fact that students might feel maybe potentially less confident in speaking with teachers. And what was great to see is how, using first names with teachers, some of the students were also student fellows were also in the same schools as some of the teacher fellows. So even calling them by their first name and learning and teaching together was something where most of them were really starting out with the same level of knowledge or experience with human rights. Not all, but to learn together was a really, I think, transformative experience for students, which was really interesting. So I did a lot of designing and facilitating different components or activities of this intensive summer institute where they learned together. And again, with others, making difficult choices about what to focus on and what do folks need to learn about human rights and human rights action. And also implementing human rights classrooms or taking rights-based approaches to work. And again, because we were trying to be as responsive as possible to the learners' needs and what they were interested in, we prepared for months in advance, but there was also every night we would sit and say, okay, what do we need to adjust? What do we need to change? So there is some kind of in real time curriculum development going on also. This year, I've been fortunate to be with the program for a couple of years, and there's different cycles. But right now, teachers are on a 2-year cycle, and the first cohort is going to be finishing this summer, and they're working on curriculum that they have implemented and working on translating those materials so that they can be used by others. And we are in the process of providing feedback on the different materials. So that's something that I'm heavily involved in. And again, it's a wonderful co-learning experience and really inspiring to see how teachers from K through 12 and many different subjects are really creatively integrating human rights into the work they're doing. For example, a music teacher using music and protest music, not only for content, but having students write their own protest songs, or a librarian design a discussion series where students take the lead in setting topics and facilitating discussions with peers, or a math teacher who is finding creative ways to integrate human rights into a math class. So it's been, I feel like it's been a wonderful learning experience for me as well to see these creative ways in which teachers have implemented, and as well with the students to advise them on their projects and see what they're able to do. I just feel really lucky to have this job.
Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. Our next program concludes our conversation with Kristina Eberbach, former Deputy Director for the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University, Human Rights Education Consultant and Adjunct Assistant Professor at Columbia University. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HRE USA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Pocket Casts, Player FM, and Deezer. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Kristi at hreusa.org. That's KRISTI at hreusa.org. Our podcast team includes producer and editor Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Redelius Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Tia Hinz, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota.